It's about history. It's about preservation. It's about sense of place here on Eastern Long Island. With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy, and this is Our Hamptons. Esperanza.
Irwin, good day to you.
Good morning. It's about history. Since again we're always full transparency. It's about preservation. This episode, even though it'll air a few months later, it's about sense of place after holiday here break. So on Eastern Long Island.
Happy New Year.
With Esperanza Leon, I'm Irwin Levy.
Asynchronous with
and this is Our Hamptons. Exactly. And Esperanza and I got her. Esperanza's production skills are just, these ideas she's coming up with are really off the charts of late. I mean, she's on a roll. And
I wouldn't say production. I mean, or like maybe artistic direction. I don't know.
Okay. Fair enough. Fair enough. She's very, Our Hamptons podcast audience, you know how modest Esperanza is. So, okay. But the point is, this was, we always have little dialogues, come up with ideas, thoughts, and this was one of Esperanza's, and it's really a terrific one. And it's, frankly, a storyline I knew a little bit about, but not as much as after we delved into it. So we're going to get right into it, and it's really, we're going to talk about the art village in Shinnecock Hills, which was really started at the very end of the 19th century, 1891, really to be exact. William Merritt Chase, that was the part, Esperanza, that I really knew about, his involvement. But it's really the village that we're going to get into, and we want to thank AAQ Quarterly put this on their website, actually from a terrific book from 2007 called Houses of the Hamptons. Gary Lawrence and Ann Searchin. Ann Searchin is a prominent architect, does a lot of writing about this. But Esperanza, and we also have a bonus Our Hamptons podcast audience, because Esperanza Leon has actually been in this community, knows it, can speak to it a little bit more with a little more familiarity than I can. But I guess we really should start really right from this article, 1891, the Shinnecock Summer School of Art, first out-of-doors art school in the United States, that's something, opened to allow amateur and professional art students from all over the country to study plein air painting with the artist William Merritt Chase.
Right. And let's remember that, this was 1891 and Chase had already been here, as you know, Irwin. He was one of the Tile Club, right? I mean, they had come out nearly 20 years, well, not quite, but almost 20 years earlier. So
very true.
This wasn't his first foray to the East End.
Right. But again, I mean, just that this was the first school, super impressive. And we have to really go right into this quote, how one student, and we're going to go somewhere with this. So one of my favorite quotes, Esperanza mentioned it as well before when we had our little pre-air dialogue about this. One of the students at this era said, "The existence of the school there is due primarily to the fact that some rich people own some poor land." So now, and again, we have to.
And that's all subjective, right? The part about rich people, maybe not, but the part about poor land, perhaps. Right. The Shinnecock Hills being what it was. They call it utterly barren and useless.
That's right. That's right.
For someone, it was, it was a natural landscape, probably full of, wildlife and plants that were beneficial to the indigenous communities living here, the Shinnecock specifically.
And that's one thing that needs to be mentioned. This landscape, it was very, very close, to the Shinnecock Indian Reservation.
At that time, but obviously it was Shinnecock land since time immemorial.
Exactly.
But at this time, the rich people were, in fact, I think it was primarily Samuel Parrish, but also I think, Mrs. Henry Kirk Porter.
That's right.
Who donated the land for the school. So we all know Samuel Parish as the Parish Art Museum.
That's right.
Came in, around this time or later on as well.
Yeah, and interestingly, and Esperanza and I were talking about this earlier. This article really starts how, and we're going to get into the description of what this art village looks like because it really it almost looks like a whimsical sort of with winding roads, very well thought out and planned. Am I right, Esperanza? The way, these narrow lanes in this little enclave, like it's almost small in scale. And the writers, Mr. Lawrence and Ms. Searchin, like start off by saying it conveys a richness that has nothing to do with wealth, which of course was just contradicted by what we just said.
Right, right.
So,
Yeah, which it's true. I mean, it's this little made up, lovely made up village. They talk about the plantings and the street gutters. Obviously, the plantings have evolved over the years. Things have grown, things
right,
have
of course.
new things have come in, but the
Yes.
street gutters are really lovely. They're like these little, cement or concrete gutters embedded with shells and stones, and it's really idyllic.
Yeah, and they use the word enchanted. The cottages were enchanted, and I really get all that. And so about 100 to 150 people studied at this art club at the William Merritt Chase School. Again, Esperanza, a theme that really comes into play a lot on our Hamptons podcast, and one that you bring up all the time. Remember, the railroad was out here at this point, and which was part, and Esperanza's made this point on numerous Our Hamptons podcasts. That was really almost symbolically and realistically the beginning of the resort community here.
Yes. In
And
the numbers, in the droves that it began
correct,
to, yes, represent.
correct. And again, there are local boarding houses owned quite often by fishermen and farmers, that where these people, these students, if you will, were staying. And, there were about a dozen cottages constructed in this compound at the behest of a Mrs. William Hoyt, who was, again, talking about who always has been attracted to this place, the daughter of Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon Chase, later a Supreme Court justice. I mean, this is, and again, on the land donated, as Esperanza said, by Samuel Parish.
Right. Right. Yes. And I apologize. I said Mrs. Henry Kirk Porter. We women were always behind these great ideas, right? The men put up the money. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
Yeah, right.
I'm sure they put up money too. But it was these two women who I wish we knew their real names and not just their married husbands' names.
Right.
Mrs. William Hoyt and Mrs. Henry Kirk Porter were the ones that requested Parish donate the land. And I wanted to correct what I said earlier, because he really was the one that owned the land, this very poor, useless land.
Exactly. And again, the individuals involved in this, it sort of reads like a who's who of the Gilded Age, Vanderbilt, Whitney,
high society,
Carnegie, it's the cast of characters you would expect that were attracted, to this thing. But it's, again, and Esperanza, you've been there. I mean, maybe we could just describe what these villages look like. I mean, and you did it already with how they were just grouped together whimsically and enchanted, and the curving and angled streets. And it wasn't what was in that era. Am I correct?
No. It to me, it speaks more of like, I don't know. It's very much a reflection of what is now also. I mean, it was also the vernacular architecture, the shingled siding and roofing and so forth. But there's an arts and crafts aspect to it. So to me, it's really like stepping into more something akin to like an English, one of those storied, typical English countryside villages, with very sort of, I don't know, there's like this airy fairy kind of quality to it. And And that is because these cottages are not tremendously large. They're
Right.
really the majority very small. Um, they're, sort of truly like cozy.
Yes.
And the land that they're built on, also the lots are also not large. There might be, I think, one or two that are of a larger scale that we've looked at, but the rest are, it's a really intimate, small
And
complex.
I like the quote here in this article where it says, lack of regularity dictated by the irregular shape of the site itself gives the complex an expansive feeling and sense of anticipation that can come only from wondering what lies around the bend. And Esperanza,
Right.
you know what that brings me to mind, I
I,
just thought of this. Go ahead.
I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to say it. And Esperanza, I wish everyone could see her face right now because she knows, she knows exactly what I'm going to say, and that's Longhouse.
Yes, exactly.
Like how when
Exactly.
you go to
Yeah.
Longhouse, and we've done a podcast on Jack Leonard Larson, and full disclosure, Esperanza and I are both involved in different ways with Longhouse, but there's always that what's around the bend that you
Yeah.
can't see right from the point when
And
you
it
pull
is
in.
that irregularity, right?
Right.
It's not the formal grid
Exactly.
or
And,
formal garden in this case of Longhouse.
and it
It's very irregular, and that
and it
gives it its charm. Hmm.
And it starts right when you pull into Longhouse. And this isn't a Longhouse podcast, but how you don't see the house from the road because Jack,
Right.
in his inimitable way, made sure it wound. It was the sense of mystery. And that's exactly what these people, again, same thinking from the left side of their brain, the whole thing. And again, Tesperanza's point, how these designs, no two were really alike. They did adhere to sort of a unifying elements, the unpainted shingles, rusted stone chimneys, low sheltering roof lines. There was a quote in the issue of the St. Paul Dispatch in 1895. I love this description, Esperanza, describing these cottages. The outer walls, washed by rains and polished by the sun, shine like satin. Wow.
Very poetic.
That
Yes.
is, yeah. I can't write like that, Esperanza. I confess to you. Anytime I think maybe, my writing skills aren't that bad, I read something like that and say, wow, I
Yeah, this would never come out of me.
would never come out of me. Yeah, it would never come out of me. But, again, and it was a self-contained, for lack of a better term, subdivision. I mean, essentially, Esperanza, it was a subdivision,
No,
you
absolutely.
know?
This is planning without real, like, it's a planned village, right? That's
Yes.
the thing. So that's why it's sort of, what to say that it doesn't come out of wealth is kind of ridiculous, because you needed money to have the land, then subdivide it, then build all these cottages, then, and create this school, which, ran for over a decade.
Yeah.
And no coincidence, the founding of the school, by the way, coincides with the founding of the Shinnecock Hills Golf Club. So, this is just south of that,
Right.
pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
So this was their terrain, of the resort summer community.
And to your point, in terms of how there had to be wealth associated because look at even the architects involved here,
Right.
Esperanza. Grosvenor Atterbury, we've spoken about him in the past. McKim, Mead, and White, the Seven Sisters, amongst other things out here. Catherine Budd, we're going to, more on Catherine Budd later. We're going to go somewhere with her, but you had the preeminent architects of the day designing these cottages. And I also like how they had very playful names. They called names such as the Half Acre,
Mhm.
the Stepping Stones, the Pillbox. As a matter of fact, speaking of Grosvenor Atterbury, his first project was designed for himself. He built his own house there.
Mhm.
And getting into a little bit, Esperanza, about, I mean, the art village itself, it's written in this article here again, Gary Lawrence and Searchin. Hard work mixed with recreational activities. Chase conducted formal criticism, and from what I've read, he was he was tough on the students too.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
guy was
No,
not warm and
people,
fuzzy.
he was well loved. I mean, at this point, he was internationally recognized. But he was teaching art. This
Right.
wasn't just a vacation for
That
people.
that's yeah.
What's so interesting is that when they would have the critiques, you'd have all these students come into the school studio to have their critique with Chase, with the
Right.
Zappos, basically, and it was like a sport.
Right.
There would be people from, I don't know if associated with any of the students, but people would just pull up in their carriages or automobiles, motor cars as they're called, and come in and witness the critiques. And at some points Chase would have to kind of let them know, listen, this is actually, like, it's a class. This is not your recreational, spectator sport here.
Yeah. This is right. He was not teaching a group of hobbyists, if you will, or
Right.
somebody,
I think
like
that's
just
true. Yeah. There were, gosh, so many noted artists that came out of his school, not only this one, but when he was teaching in the city, and then even when he taught in California.
And I read some of these quotes. He offered comments when he was doing the critiques, which I think happened on Tuesday. On Tuesdays, yeah, it said how he spent the entire day outside with models criticizing the work, and just the things he was saying. Open your sky more and paint a tree that birds can fly through. Try to paint the unusual. Never mind if it does not meet the approval of the masses. And probably my favorite one, Esperanza. I mean, there's a few here. I don't want to go through them all, but the one at the end that closed this out, how this is this is good. It usually takes two to paint a good picture. One to paint, and the other to stand by with an axe to kill him before he spoils it.
Yep. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's really good stuff. But so anyway, there were, again, there were some of the models in some cases were Chase's children or pupils. The best known, you know, Mrs. Chase, as I can't even pronounce these words, is Daniel Bouverie's Madonna. Her daughter Helen is Velasquez's Infanta. But the work here, again, to give you the
Oh, this
importance
is,
of
I'm
it.
sorry. This is
Yeah.
when this was, so this was
Yeah.
a time, and again, this coincides with, we had Thomas Moran in East Hampton,
Right.
right? And they would do, this was the fashion of the time, where they would create the tableau vivant, which is basically, people getting dressed up in costume, and they're like models, and then they
Okay.
they do a representation of a famous painting. So in this case, what you just mentioned was Mrs. Chase as this one artist, Daniel Bouverie's Madonna,
Right.
and then his daughter Helen as Velasquez's Infanta. So they would basically, it was like acting, and this was
Yes.
done with Thomas Moran's family as well. So this was very, like, this was a very typical thing that people did for entertainment, pre-TV.
Right. Right.
And Netflix. This was the Netflix of the time.
Yeah. It's a good way of putting it. And it should be noted. I mean, the work from this school, was exhibited in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, New York Art School. I mean, some of the alumni, Joseph Stella, Howard Chandler, Rockwell Kent. I mean, there were, you see some prominent people here. The architects, John Russell Pope, again, Grosvenor Atterbury and Catherine Budd, who we're going to return to. Uh, Now we spoke about this, the School of Art. It did last a little over 10 years.
Which is a pretty good time. Yeah.
It's a good run. Chase resigned as the headmaster after the 1902 season. Um, but more importantly, perhaps, Esperanza, how other schools based on the Shinnecock model opened around the United States in Cape Cod, Mendota, Minnesota, and in 1914 in Carmel, California, where Chase ended up working as the head teacher.
Teacher again. Yeah. Yeah. And my understanding, it's interesting because he did end up teaching here for that decade, which, this was seasonal. So it was a summer school. He'd be probably teaching in New York City the other
Yes.
times, right? But My understanding from what I read was that he was actually reluctant. He didn't want to teach at
Yeah,
the
right.
Shinnecock Summer School of Art. And here, he ended up being there for all this time, a decade, over a decade. So it must have been beneficial to him both financially and for his career,
Right.
for his career as an artist.
And it might have been in his DNA at this point also, like he, the joy of teaching and
Oh, no
imparting
doubt.
this,
Yeah. I mean,
I think that
yeah.
was, you know,
Yeah. And
probably
it's
played into it.
interesting that after he resigned, it's not like they went and found somebody else who could take his place and continue the school.
Right.
It just ended. So really, he was the school.
Now, we have to also bring into play, and I'm going to thank uh, Tom Edmonds for this. Tom, again, is former director of the Southampton Historical Museums, and he wrote an article about the Art Village, I think in 2022. And Esperanza and I were talking about this before we aired about the story of Laugh-A-Lot, the house called Laugh-A-Lot, and its first owner, Zella de Milhow. And Esperanza, you were pretty adamant how this is really an important part of the story that really deserves to be told, right? I mean, and I agree.
Yeah, well, I just found what little I read about Zella. I think her name was Rosella, but she was named Zella. Was so fascinating, and it ties into things that we've talked about. Again, this was the summer community, the second homeowner kind of community, as we call it nowadays. But Zella was, she was a resident. She became the owner of one of these cottages in the art village. She was an artist and then, of course, a student of the Shinnecock School of Art. But she was just such an interesting person. I mean, for one, she was an ambulance driver during World War One.
Right.
She was
Yeah.
a community organizer. And this was the best part, the first motorcycle policewoman, I don't know, in the world
I,
but in Southampton.
you have to love that. You have to love that story, especially again, thinking about it as happening when it did in the late 18, very end of the 19th century. Yeah, I mean, this was a Renaissance woman way ahead of her time. But, again, Esperanza is such a theme that continues to rear its, I'm not going to say ugly head, rear its important head. She was also about community.
Well,
I mean,
that was where I was thinking along the lines of someone like John Drew, who in East Hampton was, headed the July 4th celebrations and was part of the fire department and,
yes,
was really invested in the community, wasn't just writing a check, was really invested in the community. And this woman, similarly, and I mean, for that time, my gosh, like really not not typical of a woman of that age, right?
correct.
So I would so much love to find more information about her. But her paintings and etchings are in collections. I mean, at Guildhall, speaking of Guildhall with the John Drew, former John Drew Theater.
Right.
They have paintings at the Southampton History Museum, but not just there, National Gallery of Art, the Smithsonian. So, and I looked at her etchings, they're beautiful. So she was an accomplished artist and just like a community, as I said, a community organizer, somebody
Yeah.
who, where she originally lived in Brooklyn, organized to beautify her neighborhood. And then surely, similarly in Southampton, was very much a part of the community here. What's interesting is the name of the cottage that she had renovated with Catherine Budd. She hired Catherine Budd to do the renovation. The name Laugh-A-Lot apparently came from her associations, I would imagine, with the Shinnecock Indian tribe, because she was like an adopted daughter,
That right.
and they named her Shiola, which means she who laughs.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that was, I mean, that made it even more significant, her presence in this community in Southampton, and the fact that she, the association that she had with the Shinnecock in that period of time, which I don't think was common at all.
Completely true. And it even says in this article Tom wrote how the Apache slash Shinnecock artist David Bunn Martine said, hardly an issue of the Southampton Press went by without some reference to this amazing woman. She always managed to steal the show.
Yeah,
And,
quite
and
the
that's
character.
quite the character. And, to bring Catherine Budd in here, um, Zella's home was designed by Catherine Budd. She hired Catherine to be, Catherine Budd was a fellow student. She was the manager of the cottages, and she hired her to renovate, her own home. And Catherine Budd ultimately became one of America's, again, think of the time period we're in here. She was one of America's first female artists and architects, excuse me. And ultimately, she ran a New York City practice working with Grosvenor Atterbury, Grenville Snelling, William Appleton Potter, plans for more than 100 hospitals, churches. She created the YMCA, hostess houses on military bases during World War I. I mean, these were accomplished women doing things in an era when women weren't doing these kind of things.
No, yes, it's incredible. I mean, and the fact she wasn't even a formally trained architect is equally notable. And so when they say she was, she became the first woman member of the New York chapter of the AIA in 1924, this was after she'd been practicing architecture for more than 3 decades. And then, to have that recognition finally is.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, 1,000%. And, Esperanza, we're going to start wrapping up, but there's something at the end of, I'm going to go back to where the Houses of the Hamptons, the Art Village, by Gary Lawrence and Ann Searchin. Now, and this really, again, did you want to say something else?
Oh, okay. No, sorry. Okay. Did I clear my throat? I have something.
No. I was, we are looking at each other on Zoom, and sometimes I try to pick up a cue that is, it doesn't exist, but that's okay. And I brought this up to Esperanza initially, how, remember, this was written in 2007. So we're going back 18 years. Preparations are currently being made by the Southampton Landmarks and Historic Districts Board to have the Art Village designated a historic district. 18 years later, Esperanza, where are we with that?
I think nowhere. To the point where, to the point that just last year, 2024, one of these cottages was demolished. And, clearly this owner, could care less about the history of this, of this place. But they allegedly it's being reconstructed, which means nothing to those of us who are, preservationists. It's very nice that they're going to reconstruct it, but that's, what was the condition of the structure before? But yeah, I don't think this is remotely designated in any way. And I don't think, it should even be on the state and national register. And it's always the question in my mind is, what stops people like this idea that your individual property rights will somehow be so restricted by this type of designation by someplace else.
And Esperanza, again, I keep saying the same things, but I guess, when we're 70 some odd podcasts into Our Hamptons podcast, we've developed almost a history here, of like what we've spoken about. This exact dialogue you and I are having right now is so specific to so many places. In your beloved Wainscott, we've spoken about this. Leisure-rama, shouldn't that be some kind of a historic designation? The Sands communities, which has been a political football about this for I don't know how many years. And there are others. I mean, Beach Hampton. I mean, like, honestly, it's talked about. It's talked about. 18 years ago, it was written about by 2 people in the know. And 18 years later, it's
Well, and clearly there was something afoot, right? Like somebody was working on this, and yet it seems to be stalled. And it begs the question, really, I mean, is it a lack of real education about what is possible under, historic landmark designations? And that is not to be so restrictive that the owner can't do anything. I mean, this idea that it just limits you so much is false. It just, unless the regulation is written incorrectly, that it is too restrictive, and that has happened here in East Hampton, with many of the historic districts. It's that need to be updated. Things evolve, preservation methods evolve, and there are ways to do these things that are much more property or owner friendly, So
1,000%. And again, I just can't. This story is like so many others. The concept of preserving and the actual executing thereof seem to be at odds.
At odds, yeah. Well, and in my mind, I keep thinking, well, the issue is, in the past, you could sort of rely on people to have the respect and the love for this kind of history, to do the right thing and to preserve it and keep it as much the way it was as you could. That's not the case any longer, unfortunately. You see people tearing down 17th century structures in this community without a thought. And it's baffling. It really is baffling, because what becomes, so here you have the emphasis is on the value of the land, and that's it. And then what you're going to build on it, which is some monster house that, you can, so it's extractive. It's not about the community. It's not about the history. And, we can keep going on this.
Exactly.
But this art village is it's such an example of where a municipality just needs to step in and say, we're doing this.
Yes, exactly. Oh, boy. And that is as good a place to wrap up as anywhere, because I can't add anything to that. And that's exactly something we'd like to see. But to our Hamptons podcast audience, I know this is a place, actually the off season might be a good time to go, because I don't have to take a helicopter there. But this is a place that deserves exploration. Again, we're not talking about some zillion acres here. It's a small enclave.
It's a very small enclave. It's very sweet. It's kind of not difficult to find, but it's kind of so off the radar. That's what's so enchanting about it as well. So
worth a trip.
Explore.
Esperanza. That was great. And as always, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Irwin.
Thanks so much for joining us. New episodes of Our Hamptons are released every other Tuesday. Find them wherever you get your podcasts.